Hey, my friends, welcome once again to the Every Single Day Missionary Podcast, and this is episode 303, and today's episode is sponsored by allergies. Yes, so here in the Pacific Northwest, the environment loves to throw things at your overall immune system, especially in the springtime. For me, I enjoyed a stroll through a cottonwood debris field in the air of just this floating stuff. And by the next day, I thought I was full-blown sick, man. And it's just allergies. And I feel like the last handful of podcasts, I've come in and been like, hey, I had the flu. Hey, I was sick. And now, hey, I have allergies. So honestly, the one thing about it is I actually kind of think my voice when it's like this is kind of cooler. I wish I could keep it all the time. I'd have that like cool Liv Schreiber voice or somebody like that. But now I just have boring Matt voice most of the time. But today's is a raspy voice as we do two things. Yes, you're getting two in one. I did not get a chance to do a podcast last week. So I'm kind of like twofering in one. Two different topics. One is return to a topic. One is a new topic. And so I think they should both be interesting. All right. So let's see. Today I've titled it When the Angler is Also the Bait, and a question from episode 302. So I'm going to go back and address a question that was posed to me on social media about the last podcast. And then also I'm going to talk about this idea of the angler is also the bait. And I'm going to start with that actually. So that's the one that's interesting to me as far as something to put before us this week as we're thinking like, oh yeah, that's right. We're everyday missionaries. What does this look like? How do we do this? What is our function in this world? We're trying to figure this stuff out to bring Jesus to people that don't know Jesus, right? And so here's what I was thinking about, this idea of an angler, right? When I was a kid, I was obsessed. With fishing. Like that was my jam. Like I haven't really done much of it as an adult. I bet as an adult, I've probably gone fishing maybe 3 times, man. Like, honestly, I probably haven't gone since I was 17 years old. But when I was a kid, I mean, every chance I would get, I would go, I would do it. And there's things about fishing that are really fun, right? Like you have to know the kind of fish you're going after. You have to understand the environment you're in. That's going to kind of dictate your rods and everything else. But the big thing I remember having to deal with a lot was the whole issue of, hey, what are they biting on today, right? That was the whole thing. What's the bait? What's the lure? What's the mechanism that they're going to bite on? Because again, it isn't always the same from day to day. Like one day I might use worms and the next day I might use lures, and it would just kind of mix it up or whatever else. That made me think about then what Jesus calls us to do and some of the ways we do it. And that's probably even going to bleed into the question that comes up here from last podcast on this issue of bait a little bit. But here's what I started thinking about. So Jesus tells his first followers, his apprentices, hey, listen, I'm going to teach you how to be fishers of men and women. Like you've been fishing for fish. Great. But now we're going to change the target and it's going to be people. And ever since then we as followers of Jesus, we've used this vernacular, right? That we are to be fishers of men. And that's going to be our heart, and women, by the way, just, keep it really equal. We want to see the ladies come to Jesus as much as the men. But in light of that, though, I was thinking about a Barna report that I was just reading yesterday because I'm working on some stuff I'm doing this current series on kind of our values as a church. And the final thing on our values is asking, who can I invite? Who am I trying to see come into a walk and relationship with Jesus to be changed by him and go live like him, right? That's the idea. So in that sense, that's that fisher of men and women kind of thing. So on this Barna report, it was really interesting. This was the title, Americans Like Jesus and His Message, but not so much his messengers. Now, I know we've heard this before. I think some followers of Jesus take it to heart. They're like, yeah, I get it. I see why. I think other followers of Jesus get really defensive and say, well, it's not us. It's just that the world is hard-hearted. They don't like Jesus, so they don't like us. I think I'm probably more in the former camp of if we're really providing them and presenting them with a real authentic Jesus that is rooted in the definition of love that Paul has in 1 Corinthians, that really shows the fruit of the Spirit, really lives out the Sermon on the Mount. I think that's super compelling. And I've seen people that do not like religion respond positively to those messages. So I probably tend to more fall on the side of, yeah, it's a messenger problem, maybe more than a message or who the message is about problem, right? That's just for the record. I'm falling on a certain side with this. And I think it's sometimes followers of Jesus behaving badly hurts Jesus and message more than Jesus and message, right? They stand apart almost from sometimes the behaviors of American Christianity. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Part of that is the internet just can highlight our ugliness more. It comes out more. Our scandals have broke a lot over the last few years. There's just a lot of kind of debris out there. And so all the more we as followers of Jesus are having to dig out of a lot of bad press that isn't just bad press. A lot of it is accurately recorded press, and that's part of the dilemma, right? So anyway, in this Barna report, it kind of gives this listing of different things where they asked a population, is this positive? Do you see this positively or do you see this negatively? And then they're asking it of the total number of Christians, of other faiths, and no faiths, right? So they give you for example, Jesus Christ. Do you think positively of Jesus Christ? The total population, 71% said, yes, I think positively. Obviously, Christians, this is what's weird. Christians, 84% thought positively of Jesus Christ. I can't help but go, what about the other 16%? This is just funny to me. I read these things and I go, I don't know what to do with that. But 84% of Christians think positively of Jesus Christ. We're praying for the other 16%. People of other faiths, 58% think positively of Jesus Christ. And people of no faith, so they might be agnostic or atheist or just nothing. They don't want to describe it. 40% think positively of Jesus. So I thought, okay, that seems pretty reasonable. When it comes to spirituality, kind of very similar. Like, it wouldn't be surprising to see disbelieving people or people of no faiths actually go up a little bit in percent of spirituality. They did by 2. So 42% have a positive view of spirituality. Christians have a 75% positive view of spirituality. Again, I'm going, where's this other 25%? I don't know why there's 25% that don't have a positive view of spirituality out there among Christians, but apparently they do. The third category of the highest positive was actually the Bible. I thought this was fascinating, right? So when it comes to the total population, 63% have a positive view of the Bible. When it comes to Christians, 78%, again, you see the humor here, 78% of Christians see the Bible in a positive way. 52% of other faiths see the Bible in a positive way. And 28% of no faith individuals, they see the Bible in a positive way. So I think this is interesting because, again, that's the place I would have thought it dropped dramatically. Because for those who are critics of the Bible, they'll be like, it's filled with all kinds of murder and genocide and killing of women and babies and God sanctioning that, and David is a thug and people are sleeping around and and then it's very rigid and very narrow and da-da-da-da-da. But for all of that, that is the third highest positive for people that have no faith, or actually, in this, people of other faiths, that's the highest view they had in the top 3. 52% have a positive view of the Bible. They were higher in that category than spirituality or Jesus Christ. Or actually, with Jesus, it was 58. I take that back. But it's just interesting to me that ranked number 3, right? But again, what's the title of the article that Barna put together? Americans like Jesus and his message, so they like Jesus and the Bible in comparison to his messengers. So when it came to Christianity, the no faith category, about 21% have a positive view of Christianity. When it came to local churches in their community, it was 22%. So slightly more, because I think it's proximity. Like, okay, you know what? I think Christians are a little crazy, but there's this church in town that seems to be nice. I'll bump it up 1%, right? But then when it came to pastors, they only had an 18% positive view. And then when it came to evangelicals, of which, that's the tribe that I sort of run with, 9% of people had a positive view when it came to people of no faiths, right? Matter of fact, they have a view of evangelicals and celebrity pastors that are the same, right? They're like, not a positive view of evangelical Christians, not a positive view of celebrity pastors. We fall into the exact same category for them in that sense. And so when I look at that, I can't help but say, why? What's happening there that is that breakdown? And is Barna onto something about, hey man, people might be really poised for Jesus and even the Bible. The problem is the messengers of Jesus and the Bible have lost some credibility. And from that, the gap is still a gap. There's no bridge to kind of bridge the divide. And then from that, while we talk about being fishers of people as anglers, if you will, are we missing the right bait? All right, so this is where I roll back around to it. Because again, when I was a kid and I was all obsessed with that and you had to figure out what the bait was that they were biting on that day, I think that's still the thing for all people who follow Jesus that want to invite others to follow Jesus as well, right? We have to think, what are they biting on? Or flip it, what's repelling them? right? Because that's equally true. And when I look at this, I do think that there is this reality that there is a repellent in the water right now. And we have to realize as individuals, as much as we're doing the angling, we are also the bait, all right? We, you and I, are also the bait. What bait is for a fish is attractive. What bait is for a fish is, hey, that's something I want. That's something I notice. There's something about that I crave, and I'm going for that bait. We must be the bait, but not phony and fake and artificial and everything else. What I'm saying is, I think about Paul when he says this idea in 2 Corinthians that we are the aroma of Christ, right? Like bait in the water is aroma in that sense. And our aroma, our baitiness, if you will, needs to be such that people go, there is something about you that's really different. There's something about you that exudes this Jesus whose message I kind of like, both who he is and the book that speaks of him, because again, that got higher marks, right? Like you seem to be that thing that I've heard about, and I want to know more about that from you. That's going to have to always be the key that we think about. So the challenge before us today is like, how can I be baity? How can I be good bait? How can I be attractive bait? How can I do these things that people go, you are different? Because again, I keep always going back to this idea that what I just said, like the fruit of the Spirit is compelling. But the fruit of the Spirit is not something we can fake or muster. Like I was thinking about that, like lately, I've had some hard things going on, and yet I just have joy right now. Like I still just have joy in the midst of hard things. And it's like, why? And I'm like, because I have really centered my attention hugely on what does it mean to be filled with the Spirit? Because I believe if I'm filled with the Spirit, even in the hard things, I have joy. Even in the hard things, I can have peace. Even in the hard things, I can be gentle. Like there's something transcendent about that. And I think in dealing with the disbelieving or skeptical world, that's pretty compelling. It is hard to say, oh, bullcrap, that's a lie. You're not really joyful in hard things. You're not really kind and patient and peacemaking. Nah, no way. Like, it stands out. Or when I talk about Paul's definition of love, right? It's a powerful definition. Like, it's so powerful. In fact, it's interesting. I don't know if it was the last podcast, the one before, but I think I might have talked about hupomone, right? And no, actually, I was talking about hamartia. I was talking about sin. I'm like throwing out Greek words. So hamartia, right? So this idea of missing the mark. And in Greek, part of the idea of missing the mark is not simply disobeying is missing the mark, but it's also maybe obeying, but not in the strength of God, but rather in your own strength. There is a nuance within that word that it can be sin to just white knuckle obey, but not do it in the strength of the Spirit that works in you, right? And I think that's probably where I'm so fixated today, is to be like, when Jesus said he was leaving us and he was leaving something behind, he said he was leaving behind not the Bible, though I love the Bible. He said he was leaving the Spirit. The Spirit would teach us, the Spirit would guide us, the Spirit would empower us. And therefore, I think part of what this is, or part of what I wonder, is in the process of being bait, maybe part of the challenge of the day is that we are not as Spirit-led as we are kind of dogma-focused. And because we're dogma-focused, it doesn't squeeze out of us that fresh aroma of Jesus, but rather it just feels more like religion at times. And religion isn't attractive, but the stuff of the Holy Spirit is attractive, right? And so I get how challenging that is. Like when Paul's like, hey, walk in the Spirit, live by the Spirit. It seems so ominous. It's way easier to say, can I just live by my dogma rules? Can I just emphasize my dogma rules? Because if I do that, then I can checklist that whole thing. But I think there's something a little bit more, maybe the word mystical would come into living life in the Spirit. Something where it's outside of your control, but you're desperate for God to control your life. And then from that, what comes out? He presses this aroma out in you. He presses this baitiness out in you, and people go, ooh, that's attractive. That's interesting. Because I do think the reason the masses were so attracted to Jesus is that stuff oozed from him, because he is the embodiment of those very things, right? He is the fruit of the Spirit incarnate in that sense. And so this is where I think for us, we have to start thinking through like, hey, what is the most attractive things that would be attractive to disbelievers that might woo some to Jesus, right? And I think that word woo is even good, right? Because again, that's what bait does. It woos a fish in that sense, right? And we need to be about the same kind of business, right? To be attractive in those ways. Because again, we do have a PR problem. I've said that before. There's no question about that. It's interesting as I'm getting to know a lot of maybe frustrated or even hostile to Christian faith people in our community, how quickly that melts away when I get a chance to just hang with them, talk with them, and how I can start to have like legitimate spiritual conversations with them, because they're like, there's something different about the way you're trying to do this, and we're not turned off by the way you're doing it. We actually think it's kind of cool the way you're doing it. That's not to toot my own horn, I promise, because I'm very messed up. That I use this as an example to say I really believe in this methodology because I do think it's most like Jesus, and I think the more we go, what matters most that the world sees is, if Jesus were here today, how would he feel and look and function? And if I'm meant to be like Jesus, right, then what are the things I need to do that, right? If he was gentle and lowly in heart and people were finding rest for their souls because his burden was easy and light, like, how can I do that thing? How can I build authentic relationship or authentic, how can I be a traveling safe space for people, if you will? So they go, that dude that loves Jesus feels safe for me. I'm happy to be around them. And then from that, I pick up things from him. And maybe that's the organic way that transformation happens, the organic way that mission actually happens. Because I think there is the ivory tower version, and then there is the real boots on the ground version. Now, I want to be clear. I love ivory tower. I love talking shop. I love information. I could spend all day just talking about theoretical ideas, right? And I can get into big verbose words and lofty sentences and everything else. But I think the ivory tower version of evangelism is not how actual evangelism works. I think actual evangelism in our culture today, the bait is different than it was 50 years ago. The bait is different than it was 20 years ago. And where it used to be the institution could do it, well, now in this list, it's very clear the institution is not trusted. Institutional leaders are not trusted. Christians are not trusted as organizations any longer, even among Christians. Like, that's the crazy part, right? So people that love and follow Jesus, they have concerns about the organization and institution of Christianity. Therefore, I think what switches now is that we as individuals, we've got to be the most amazing bait, right? We do. We have to embody it. We have to be the stuff that is the attractant for others to maybe consider Jesus, right? That's how it has to work. And again, I think that's, again, organic, and I think it's nuanced, I think it's relational, and I think it's establishing rapport and safety and a sense of trust. Because again, all of that is working against us. We have to reestablish all of that as to hopefully get people somewhat curious, right? So that's part of the key here. And so with that, then I want to launch into the question that I had from my friend Steve Mount. So he put this on the Redemption Church Facebook page. Steve's an old friend of mine. In fact, it's really funny. I came here 16 years ago, and his daughter, Katie, was under a year old, I think, or right around a year. Sweet little thing, was in this half-body cast because she had to have special surgery on her legs. I think it might have been related to like her adductor muscles and tendons in relationship to that. And so they had to do some stuff. I forget exactly. But it's fun now being a trainer at the gym, and I see Katie coming into the gym, and just crushing it. Like, she's just such a powerhouse, man. It's so awesome. And so it's really a lot of fun to be in a community long enough that you see people go from babies to like full on like adults that are just getting it done, and she's just crushing it in the gym. So anyway, that's just a sidebar. But anyway, so my friend Steve put this on Facebook. And so I wanted to kind of address his different questions, and I'll see if I can kind of pull it all together. So, and I might do these in the order that they come. So it says, how can you be Christ-like and not have theological accuracy? If you don't have the right view or understanding of God, then you don't have the right view or understanding of what it means to be Christ-like. If you're only practicing certain characteristics or traits of Jesus, let's take compassion as an example, without a full picture of God, then are you doing the act of compassion for yourself or for Jesus? And so this goes back to the previous podcast where I talked about Christ-likeness versus theological accuracy. Now, when I responded initially to Steve on Facebook, I said, dude, I got a full week. I'll get back to you on Facebook. Hey, Steve, this is why I'm doing it, because it's just easier for me, because I'm still really busy, and to write a thing would be tough. I thought, I'll just do the podcast, and you can hear my voice that way. So, but I gave an example where I said, hey, how about we go have a beer and we talk about it, very much in the spirit of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, right? So two powerhouse writers of the 20th century, in a lot of ways, probably two of the most influential people in the 20th century. And they each belonged to a church that those churches said the other guy was going to hell. So Tolkien is a good Catholic. The Catholic Church is like, the Church of England is going to hell because its theology is wrong. Church of England is like, you know what? We're looking at the Catholics saying, you're going to hell because your theology is wrong. And the tragic thing is, I think both Tolkien and Lewis loved Jesus. They loved each other. I think they're both having a great time. I don't want to say drinking a pint in heaven. Oh, no, wine. They're drinking wine in heaven. We know wine's in heaven. They're drinking wine in heaven, and they're talking about, man, if we would have had another 20 years, we would have made another trilogy, and you would have done this. And I'm sure they're talking about stuff. And that's a little bit of my point. My point is, sometimes institutions, the good of having a theological system within your institution is it can forge unity for the institution. The downside, I believe, is that it can say, and all other institutions are going to hell, all right? And that's the risk. And it doesn't measure two things. First, doesn't measure out whether my institution is got it 100% right, because here's what I really do believe. No church on the planet is getting theology 100% right. I don't know what percentage it might break down as, right? So are the Arminians more right than the Calvinists, or the Calvinists more right than the Arminians? I don't know. Each side would say the other side has some pretty dangerous thinking, right? So the Calvinists will say the Arminians risk works salvation to maintain your salvation because they believe you can lose it. So they'll be like, you guys kind of believe that your works maintain your salvation. That seems to be a big risk. But the Arminians look at the Calvinists and they go, you believe that God is just pre-planning the destruction of most everybody that will ever be born before the world was ever made. Like, you consciously decided you just didn't want to save the majority, and there is no hope for them, and they have no free will to make a choice for the gospel. So why even bother preaching the gospel? It just doesn't matter. Like, both sides look at the other side saying, you have some maybe serious problems, and from that have dire consequences, theologically speaking. And yet I would probably look and go, Arminians are saved. Calvinists are saved. Their theology is very, very different, right? But they're saved. And so maybe that's what I'm getting at a little bit. Like I've said many times on the podcast, I think Christianity is best captured in the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. Like that's the theology maybe that matters, all right? Maybe I'll say it that way. Like, that's the orthodoxy. The center of orthodoxy are these rather short statements after hundreds of years where Christians said, and this is what Christianity is. There's something valuable about that. So I say that because I don't want to go 2,000 years later, my little theological system. So evangelicalism, like 250 million people total in the world, that is the only accurate theology, and therefore those are the only saved people, and they're the only ones that can be truly Christ-like because they're the only ones that have the greatest amount of stock when it comes to truth. Like, the Eastern Orthodox doesn't have as much stock. The Catholic Church doesn't have as much stock. The non-evangelical, all the other Protestant things that are non-evangelical, they don't have as much stock as we do. That's always my concern because I think it kind of creates a bit of a hubris, like we cracked the code and figured it out. And B, I think it's a little bit kind of disrespectful to all of our other brothers and sisters in other Christian traditions that we say, almost like, because you don't have right theology, it's impossible for you to be as Christ-like as we are, because our right theology makes us Christ-like. So that's a part of like my pushback on it, is to say, I don't think any of us have theology figured out perfectly. See, and here's maybe a little bit of the way I define it. There's theologians and then there's Bible scholars, and they're kind of two different worlds. And I would say historically, I was very much in the theologian camp. I would say in recent years, I've tried to take those lenses and not remove them completely. I think it's totally okay to read the Bible through our lens, right? So you could say, I'm Protestant, that's a lens. I'm evangelical, that's another lens. I'm Calvinistic, that's another lens. I'm cessationistic, that's another lens. Like, we have these, and then we can read the Bible, but we have to understand that we're reading the Bible through a series of lenses, and that will shape our reading because of the lenses to kind of create almost like an echo chamber of belief system. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying it's still layers of humanness reading the text. And in that, there's probably a good chance of inaccuracy in the quest for trying to be really, really particular. Like, the more particular we get, the more we're risking maybe getting off the trail of perfect accuracy. So again, my camp doesn't have it all figured out. And I think that's the point I'm getting at, is to think that we can, I think, is weird when I look at the history of the church, right? Like, if you look at the history of the church, what it really is a series of hey, the guys before us got it wrong, and we're going to reinvent in a new way, right? So that's the Semper Reformata, always reforming. I took a great class. I think I mentioned this in one of the podcasts. Took a great class, my recent master's degree, and it was not a history of Christianity. It was the history of the development of theology through the history of Christianity. Mind-blowing. I mean, and again, this was a Southern Baptist seminary. So again, conservative, evangelical, all those kinds of things. But when you look at just how much theology has morphed and changed, and all of it's schism, right? All of it is like, this guy fights with this guy and he starts a new group, and then they get in a fight and they start a new group, and everybody's more accurate than the last is what they think, right? And I think for me, looking at that big picture, that's where I go. This idea that any of us could be, and I'm going to air quote it now, theologically perfect, or our theology is the most right. I just have some skepticism about that because I know we're all too human, right? And so that's why I say the more important measurement in my thinking is Christ-likeness. This idea, like, to put it maybe a little differently, I'll talk about my own camp. So I keep joking nowadays that I'm Calvinish, right? But I'm Calvinish. And in my Calvinishness, I find oftentimes in my camp to be pride, to be coldness, to be bitingness. I think not always, but in a lot of ways there is this, we have it more figured out than anybody else. I have seen in different Calvinistic environments kind of almost like a grace is only a theology, but it's not really a felt practice. And I'm not saying every Calvinist and every Calvinistic church, I'm not saying that, but again, I've been running with that clan for a long time, right? I'm familiar with it. And there is some stuff where I wouldn't look at that movement and be like, I see such Christ-like people always. Like I think I see very theological people, but I also find that there is shortness in there, and there's particularity in there, and there's a kind of a judgmental spirit that is always kind of swirling about in there, and sort of a mockery of other groups and Christians out there. And I think that's the place where I kind of go like, okay, so let's say it's the most theologically accurate. If it is and does, shouldn't it lead to the most Christ-likeness? And it doesn't always, right? So that's probably what I'm trying to get at here, you know? So I don't think I'm talking about the most radical heterodox ideas in the world. I'm just saying within the scope of those who claim the name of Christ, I do find like there are, people in other groups completely, like a Franciscan monk, where I read them, I listen to them, and I go, wow, that looks like Jesus, man. That sounds like Jesus. This person is doing the work of Jesus. Or I look at like Mother Teresa, right? Like I go like, she was doing Jesus stuff, man. Like serious Jesus stuff. And it breaks my heart that I have evangelical friends that go, yeah, she's in hell. She's Catholic, right? I'm like, wow, she looked like such a radically transformed person that did the stuff that most of us wouldn't do, don't desire to do. I just think it's sad that we're the denizens of who we think goes to heaven and hell and who is really in or out based on our theology when we're not measuring who reminds me most of Jesus Christ. Because Christ-likeness, not dogma, is the measurement that we should all really use. And so maybe then, I guess, to try to answer the question in two ways, when I kind of talk about theological accuracy, I guess what I am saying is we have the assumption that we're most accurate. And I think that's an assumption, but I don't know if it's the reality. So we should be more humble in that realm. And more importantly, we should be caring about, A, do I look like Jesus? And B, do I appreciate others who look like Jesus, who may not share my system? Because that's actually what matters most in the end, is that very thing, right? If you're looking like Jesus, acting like Jesus, thinking like Jesus, feeling like Jesus, doing Jesus stuff, that's kind of the real big idea. And that's the thing that we should care about. And I do think that the Jesus-like stuff is, we're doing the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, we're exuding the fruit of the Spirit, and we're living the definition of love. That's my quadrilateral, I've decided. Like, let's start there, and then we can figure out all the other stuff. But I think that's really, really critical. Because, again, I think that's the real fruit of the message. And maybe that's what I'm getting at in the end. The fruit of the message is really what matters for us. I'm not saying the message doesn't matter. What I'm saying is, if it bears the right fruit, Jesus talks about that. In fact, I was having a conversation this week with somebody, this just popped into my head, about people go to Jesus in the end and say, Lord, Lord, look what we did in your name with signs and wonders, and even the demons obeyed. And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. But that comes at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. That's not a statement detached from the Sermon on the Mount. That's a statement at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And I'd go, it's a cohesive sermon. What he's saying is, if you fail to embody, embrace, and exude the Sermon on the Mount, you're that person that's going to one day say, look what I did for you. And he says, depart from me, I never knew you. The way we know Jesus is we do the Sermon on the Mount. The way we know we're known by Jesus is we do the Sermon on the Mount. If we don't do the Sermon on the Mount, that's like almost like, do we know Jesus? That isn't a theological system. That's biblical text, right? And so I go, it's there at the end of the sermon, and then he talks about building on two foundations to say, which foundation are you building on? You building on religion? Or are you building on this sermon? Are you building on upside down and backwards kingdom stuff? And when it comes to that previous part of the podcast about people like Jesus in the message, but not as messengers, I think part of that is I would probably concur that I see, especially like on social media, I see the most un-Sermon on the Mount like things said from people that claim the Sermon on the Mount. I see the most un-Sermon on the Mount statements and memes from people that would claim the Sermon on the Mount. And I go, no wonder the world is turned off. We're rejecting the Sermon on the Mount, some of us, openly for our politics or for our frustrations or just to be cocky or whatever, or troll somebody. And I go, man, we got to do the business differently. So that's the idea on theology. I'm not like, I think that there is 100% pure, accurate theology out there, and God in his wisdom refuses any of us to have it fully. Because then it keeps us to be dependent on him. It makes us more humble before him. Now, we work, we grow, we think. I mean, that's one of the biggest things for me. I look at the last 30 years of my life. I've grown a lot. I've learned new things. I've kicked this out, put this in, realized this is wrong, put that in as right. Probably in 10 more years, the thing I thought was right, I'm going to pull it out as wrong. I think that's sanctification. That's the growth of all people. But I think the thing there always is stay in tune with the Spirit, stay in touch with the Spirit, stay oriented on Jesus, not on dogma or religion or those kinds of things. Like you're always fixated on Jesus and then Scripture. Again, I'm incredibly big on Scripture. Like, this is the thing I'm realizing more and more. Like the reason I kind of shove theology a little over to the left of the text is because I go, I want to read the text in its own merits. Like, I'm going to take the text at its face value and try to be really cautious about the sheer volume of lenses that I can read it through, because historically that's what I've done. I've like loaded up on theology. I put on my glasses with the glasses, and I read it through that lens. And then when I realized I pulled it all off and I just tried to just take the text at face value, it's far more beautiful, far more wondrous, far more perplexing, honestly, because sometimes the reason we put on the lenses is to clean up the things that we don't understand. I'm finding there's real beauty in going, I don't know what that's talking about. I have no idea. There's 5 different ways that can be understood. I love that. I think that's super cool. You could tell I get excited about that. But the goal is always Christ-likeness in the end. That's the goal. And I think sometimes, especially in evangelicalism, where there's these higher views of certain things like theology, and we can nail the truth and we can have the most answers. I think kind of in that space, we could run the risk of being more reminiscent of Pharisees than we are of Jesus if we're not careful. I say that coming out of a MacArthur background and everything else, like, much of that was there, like just living in that space, dwelling amongst those people. There was a lot of that, and that's probably what I'm always kind of nervous about. So anyway, that answers that. I'm already 32 minutes into this podcast. I better get going. All right. So the second thing there was, maybe to answer the question, compassion for yourself or for Jesus, just love of Jesus, not compassion for myself, love of Jesus. I just love Jesus, man. I want to do these kinds of things out of love of Jesus. Like I'm motivated out of a love of Jesus. That's what I do now. As far as Jesus spending time with others who might be seen as the fringes, he had a name for them and a purpose for spending time with them. No. If you spend time with people because you believe Jesus would have us as well, do you call them to repent and believe the gospel of Jesus Christ? Or do you only show superficial love and compassion and feed their narcissistic need for attention and acceptance? I'll say lovingly, you could say that nicer, because you've definitely categorized them in a certain way that maybe this is part of what I'm getting at. Like they all read and they go, hey, this guy Steve thinks we're all narcissists. He's a Christian. That's just my loving encouragement to you to maybe choose different words in describing disbelieving people, because I think this is part of the problem. They see us as an us and them, and we want to see them as image bearers of God. Maybe I would encourage that. With that said, though, I'm going to go back to this ivory tower versus boots on the ground thing. So, why did Jesus spend time with the sinners and the tax collectors? He loved them. He loved them. They bear his image. He cares about them. He called them friends, right? While they were still in those states. So is his objective to step into their world and see their lives changed, to see them oriented from darkness to light, to see them oriented from estranged from God to in relationship with God? Absolutely, 100%. And the way he did that is he spent time with them, he ate with them, he drank with them, he loved them, and he called them friends, right? So I think this is the way it's done. This is how we're bait, right? We're showing the beauty of Jesus in a compelling way. And when we do that, and we're just leaning into people that don't see the world as we do, people that, again, I'm finding many are warm to Jesus, and weirdly enough, many are warm to the Bible, but they're not warm to Christians. And part of it is because maybe that statement right there, if they're like, we just see them as narcissistic and they're wanting their fill, then they're going to go, man, you think pretty badly of me. Wow, I didn't know you see me in such a terrible light, right? And so this is where, again, I think the boots on the ground version is different than the ivory tower version. So the ivory tower version is we have this theological strand of what we go, this is how somebody gets saved, right? And we load it up with our words. So they have an awareness of their sin. They have repentance. They believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they're going to be saved. But the way we do that with boots on the ground in the real world is different than the way we articulate it in a theology class or a Sunday school environment, right? And here's what I mean by that. And maybe I'll even, since this is an open question from Steve, I feel like I can use you as the example of how I think you would do this. This is how I seek to do this, which is a little different than the ivory tower version that we sometimes go, are we doing this, right? And I'm like, I think it's more real. So here's what I know about you, Steve. So I'm talking right now to Steve, but everybody gets to listen to the conversation, and then we'll have a beer and talk about it more. But what I know about you is that you do care about people coming to follow Jesus. I know you care about that. And you're a business owner. And I know that every person that walks in your store, if they don't know Jesus, you're going to want them to know Jesus, right? You're going to. And so maybe you have a repeat person. You know, they keep coming in and they're doing business with you and everything else, and you're building conversation. And then one day you say to them, you know, like, yeah, I had a great day at church yesterday. And they're like, oh, you go to church? No way. I used to go to church, but I gave up on it and everything else. And just, you know, I don't know about all the Bible stuff. There seems to be a lot of craziness, and I just kind of let everybody do their own thing. And you're like, hey, it's cool, I get it, you know. But, you know, for me, Jesus has really changed my life and just has made a huge difference in my marriage and my kids. And it's a big thing for me. It just really is the center of my life, you know. And they go, oh, that's cool. And then they come in a few weeks later, and they're a little down. And you're like, hey, man, what's going on? Is everything okay? And they're like, yeah, just lots going on. You know, my wife and I, we're not getting along, and we're kind of starting to talk divorce and everything else. And I'm just feeling lost and alone and confused. And, you know, I know you said you go to church, you know, like, can I come with you this Sunday? And you'd be like, dude, absolutely, right? So let's say they come that Sunday. And afterward, you take them out to lunch, and they're like, man, maybe I need God again. Maybe I just need faith or church or something. I'm just feeling aloof, you know? And you're like, oh, man, you know what? You can accept Jesus right now. You can accept him right now. You know, you just say, Jesus, you know what? Just say, I've sinned. I've gone my own way. I've done my own thing. I'm desperate for you. I need you to take control of my life. Jesus, step into my life. Change me. Make me new. Make me a part of your family. Dude, let's pray that right now. You pray that with him. And he prays that. Are you going to say at the end of that, this dude's a Christian? And I'd say, I think you would. And I think that's a more organic way that these things happen. I don't think at the table you would say, well, here's what you need to do. You need to repent of your sins and believe the gospel. Otherwise, you're going to go to eternal conscious torment. I'm going to walk you through a formula. Like, I don't think that's the way it gets done. And that's always, I think, my heart. I mean, even here on the podcast, it's called The Everyday Missionary because I'm trying to help all of us think, how can I bring Jesus in authentic, normal, not like strange, otherworldly sounding ways, but in ways that I think the work actually gets done, right? Because I think there's a difference between the ivory tower system and the way mission actually gets done. I think mission gets done when you're amidst a people, loving a people, caring for a people, rubbing shoulders with those people, invested in their lives, invested in them, caring about their kids, caring about their lives, in everything that matters to them. And then you're looking for ways to bring that message in a way that's real normative, right? Like just normal speak kind of way, because the heart in there is so critical to this whole thing. So in light of that, like, why would we go to different groups that are not like us? And is it just to appease their narcissism, or is it to do Jesus? I would say it's to do Jesus, right? It's not. it's not to appease their narcissism, nor would I call it their narcissism. I would call it their way of understanding their world based on where they are at in this world. And I think it's really smart of an everyday missionary to try to understand their world and integrate into it to some degree if you're going to be bait, right? Bringing it back to the top. If you're going to be bait, doing it that way, right? And so I think our baitiness or lack of baitiness is critical in all of this. And the only way you can be bait with the fish is you go hang out with the fish and you be bait. And it's easy to stand on the sidelines and I just point out how that bait is wrong. I'm not saying you're doing that. I'm just saying people do this. And I'm like, no, man, we got to be in the water. Got to be in the water with the fish, man. Got to be in the water with the fish. And you got to be in the water with them where they're at. Like, Paul gets into this in 1 Corinthians 9. Like, I'm becoming all things to all men. I'm eating bacon with those guys. I'm not eating bacon with those guys. I'm hanging out with the weak here. I'm hanging out with the strong there. I'm going to talk their language here. I'm going to talk their language there. Like, that's just the way I think it gets done. I think that's the way we're meant to do it. And so, this could be agree to disagree, but I actually think if we're really going to be reaching people, it's not going to be from the ivory tower. It's not going to be, kind of talking about wokeness and making America great again and getting back to Christian roots. And that, like, those are the anti-baits. Those are the things that are not only turning off the disbelievers, it's causing a lot of believers to walk away from the church for the same reason. Because they're like, this doesn't represent Jesus. This represents something else, right? And I think some of that stuff needs to get retired. And I think we need to be thinking every day when I hit the pavement, how am I an attractive Jesus follower to those who don't follow Jesus, in the hopes that we will start a conversation and from that they might actually become a Jesus follower. I think it's that kind of organic and normal and boots on the ground. And I think that's the stuff that we should be way more preoccupied with, like actually getting work done as opposed to theoretically talking about the work and not getting the work done, or talking about reaching the lost, but we never hang out with the lost in loving ways. Like, that's probably the big idea I think I have in all of this. And so that's kind of my heart. Maybe there's probably more ways to answer that, but I think I'm trying to keep it general and say, hey man, we got to be baity. We got to be Jesus-like. We got to be hanging out with the fish, and we got to be legitimately loving the fish, not angry at the fish. Like, that's, again, especially what I see on social media. We have a mutual friend, you and I, Steve, that loves to post stuff that is so not the Sermon on the Mount. And then the next post is going to be, Jesus didn't hang out with, literally, one of them was, Jesus didn't hang out with sinners to be their friend. He hung out with them to call them to repentance. And I'm like, yeah, but everything you're saying here, any disbeliever just is going to go, you're a mean, angry Christian guy. Like, it's the opposite of bait, And I think that's the thing. We have to flip the script on this, because we're bleeding out, man. We're bleeding out. We're losing credibility. We're choosing the wrong battles. I think I was just reading in the Barna report, I think it's 1,800 Christians a day are leaving the church now. Like, something's gonna have to change. And a lot of those people that are leaving are saying, because I just don't see Jesus coming out of my evangelical community. I kind of agree with that. Maybe not as dire as some. I look at people at Redemption. They're amazing, man. Like, dude, I'm not sure where you're at church. I think Doc's maybe, I'm not sure where, but like, honestly, dude, like, I look at it and go, man, people at Redemption are so awesome. And I'm so happy to be running with these people. I think these are people that are turning the tide, but I think it takes all of us to be like thinking differently and turning this tide in different ways and really practicalizing what it means to bring Jesus to people, because I think that's the heart. So then last, it says, I would argue that the first is both Christ-like and theologically accurate, and the second is self-centered and perpetuates a lie. Hopefully, based on what I've kind of articulated here, at least I've answered that. I don't know if I would agree. I would agree with you from a different point of view, but not from the point of view that I'm trying to present. That's what I would say. So, like, I appreciate if we were talking about a super radical, not Nicene Creed, not Apostles' Creed oriented theology, right? So now if we're talking Hinduism or something, like, I get that, you know what I mean? But I think even as an encouragement, there's always nuance in conversations. And I think when we make it A or B, positive or negative, black or white, it actually defeats the ability to kind of come and reason together and try to find the commonality. And I think maybe that statement is one of the statements I go, this is partly what I'm trying to paddle upstream against, is this idea that if it's not this, it's that. So if it's not Christ-like and accurate, it's self-centered and perpetuates a lie. And I go, I don't think anything I've said today you would say is self-centered and perpetuates a lie. But I also would say it's probably not something that you're fully going to agree with. And I think that's in part maybe what I'm getting at about the beauty of the Christian faith for 2,000 years across multiple traditions is It all has pieces of the truth, and I think enough of the pieces that matter, right? So I think the Eastern Church, the Western Church, the divided Western Church has enough of the pieces that matter. I know not everybody agrees with that, but in my world, I actually think Jesus' church is wild and diverse, and he loves that, and none of it's got it all figured out, and none of it's perfect, and none of it's kind of cornered the market on, quote, truth, right? And I put that in air quotes, truth, because we all kind of have pieces of it. It's almost like, and this is a weird analogy and it's imperfect, but you know how people use the analogy that truth is an elephant and then all the religions are feeling different parts and saying it's like an ear, or it's like a tail, or it's like a trunk, or whatever else. I would use that analogy for Christianity. I think Christianity for 2,000 years, it's like the elephant. And the Catholics go, well, it's like a trunk, and the Eastern Orthodox goes like an ear, and the Evangelicals goes like a tail, and the Pentecostals go, no, it's like, I guess it's like the noise that an elephant makes because I'd be speaking in tongues. I don't know, but I think there is this thing that we all have the central truth that matters, the central theology that matters, and then from there we have diversity, and Jesus uses that diversity to reach people. The Catholic Church is only going to reach certain kinds of people that the Evangelical Church never would reach. The Evangelical Church is going to reach certain people that the Pentecostals would never reach. The Pentecostals are going to reach people that the Evangelical cessationists are never going to reach. I don't think that's a bug. I think that's a feature. I don't think that's a problem. I think that's Jesus' solution to reaching diverse peoples in diverse ways with his church being diverse. I think that's a cool thing. Again, we may not agree, but I think that's a cool thing. So anyway, just wanted to answer that, not simply for Steve, though I do love my man Steve. I really do. Like, we've been friends for a long time. And I know Steve's heart ultimately. So, man, brother, I love you, dude. And thanks for the question. Like, when you asked, I'm like, man, I love this question. It gives me a chance to re-unpack some of this stuff. And again, part of the thing, hopefully we can even model here for everybody that's listening is we can have friendships with people where we don't always see everything eye to eye, but we can appreciate, hey, Jesus is working in that person. Jesus is doing stuff through their things. Jesus is working around the world in different ways. And that's an epic thing because at the end of the day, he's calling us all to be anglers who are also bait, who have a good baity smell that people go, I see the bait. I'm interested in the bait. I want to see that where that goes and what that does and how that might even be something for me, because when we're doing it that way, then we're being effective everyday missionaries.